Another important element to talk about, I think, is this whole question of unionization. I've been doing a lot of workshops on employer and employee rights and responsibilities, and I often ask people in the room, so how many of you are unionized? And guess how many hands go up, Sam?
How many hands?
Zero.
Zero hands.
People in the community sector, there are certainly some community organizations that are unionized, but very, very few.
See, that's very interesting because I was working previously in the French community sector, and there was a growing movement to unionize in the French community sector, especially for like street outreach workers or people who are really vulnerable to like government funding cuts. So it's interesting to hear how different sectors are offended.
And then to think about that in terms of, does it make sense to have some unionization in your workplace? The other thing that some community-based organizations have, and I've seen it more in the larger ones, is an association of employees.
Right.
So not that legal, formal arrangement to have a union in place, but something that represents, an association that represents the employees so that they can have a relationship with management that can really get at some of the problems that exist in the organization and some things that are written down in a clear way. So those are mechanisms to think about. We've got the law, but there's also the route of going unionized and also the route of becoming an association.
And just organizing together to ask for what you're looking for together. And if you are in an organization that's unionized and you don't know, you know there's some kind of collective agreement, which is a contract that covers all the employees in the organization, but you don't know where it is and you don't know what it says, you want to get in touch with whoever the union that you're associated with, and they can give you a copy of that contract. And if in that contract there's something missing or there's something that's not clear, just remember that the Act Respecting Labor Standards, this little booklet that talks about the labor standards in Quebec, will always be the minimum standards. You can never contract under the minimum.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Sam, because I think we tend to forget that.
Yeah, exactly.
So another element when we think about rights and responsibilities is thinking about health and safety. And that's where we all throw around that word, the CSST. Commission de Santé et Sécurité au Travail. We contribute as employers and employees towards that commission, and it's there to help protect us when there's work-related accidents. And so it's really important to be aware of that and to make sure that if there is something that happens on the work site that we contact the commission in order to have adequate follow-up, and often that involves compensation.
Absolutely.
Over time for work-related accidents.
And I think people usually associate the CSST with like folks working in industrialized factories or really a particular type of work accidents. And we should give a lot of credit to the folks who did fight really hard, usually from unions, for this kind of protection. But I have to say, in my time working in offices, I've seen CSST inspectors come because there was, a problem with the dust in the walls. I've seen people have work accidents, even with computers falling. I mean, things happen around our office, and we're legally obliged, if we have even one employee, to register and pay CSST contributions. So it's a really important thing to make sure you're following, and it's again one of those things that as an employer you can later be made to pay what you haven't paid before. Yeah,
and it's in the info sheet, the information around it. So that's something to check to make sure that you really are following that. It's one of those ones, and again, something we see in organizations sometimes. These forms come in from the government, and they might be because they're in French, it might be because they look bureaucratic, it might be because they're from the government.
Right.
People kind of put them aside and stick them under a pile. Not the thing to do.
Not the thing to do.
If you're not sure what it's about, what it means, what you should be doing with it, you can give Coco a call, and we'll just walk you through what it's about, because these are important fundamental forms that need to be filled in.
And the last thing I just want to add about that is that if you're an organization that has volunteers and some regular volunteers, you can actually sign up to have your volunteers covered as well. And there's a little thing that they'll do where they consider volunteers as if they work at minimum wage, and then volunteers who are hurt while they're doing voluntary work for you could be compensated. So it's an interesting thing to note, and there's more information again available in our info sheet about
and some people are getting that coverage more through their insurance, and we might get at that in our other webcast on board liability. But certainly looking into the CSST option is something you want to think about.
For sure. Okay. So Francis, something that I hear a lot about and that people are pretty concerned about and find confusing is this idea of source deductions and employer contributions. So source deductions, this thing that comes off your paycheck, employer contributions, this thing that organizations have to pay themselves when they have employees. Can you talk a little bit about that and the obligations?
So certainly one of the responsibilities that employers and employees have is to make sure that they're contributing to those legalized deductions that can be taken.
Yep.
Federal and provincial government. So this is things like employment insurance, contributing to CSST.
Yep.
So what happens is, as an employee, we have source deductions that are taken off, and we're aware of those because we see them listed on our paycheck.
Right.
As an employer, and if you don't, check with your employer. As an employer, we have an obligation to make sure that we're contributing those employer contributions. And those amounts can shift a little bit every year, every fiscal year. And so what we need to do is make sure that we're receiving, and you should automatically be receiving from both provincial and federal government at the beginning of January, what those new amounts are, if the percentages have gone up or down a little bit. The other thing that's really helpful when we think about employer contributions and source deductions is this idea that a lot of the computer programs that people are starting to use to do their bookkeeping, you can enter the percentages, and the program can help you do that.
Right. So, and there's even some free programs available on the Revenue Quebec and Revenue Canada websites so that you can make those calculations pretty easily. And I think something that's really important to remember when you're talking about the employer contributions and source deductions is this is one of the the largest issues for board members to think about, because board members can be held personally responsible if the deductions and contributions are not being paid. And so we've seen cases where people up to 3 years later get some pretty hefty bills for these amounts, and you know, you're at home, you get a bill for an organization, you're not even on the board anymore, and that's because those amounts haven't been paid. So it's something to pay particular attention to. We'll talk a little bit more about it in the board liability videocast.
Yeah, and that's where that whole question of board oversight, and going back to what we started with, the board members do have a responsibility as the employer. Doesn't mean you're doing it all, but making sure that these systems are in place and that they are being handled adequately.